So my dear students, in the last class we have seen the transaction and its asset properties. So today we will discuss the transaction state diagram. So we resemble the transaction with the process. So similar to process is having a state. Similar to the transaction is also having states. So you can see a 6-state transaction state diagram. So the very first state, when the transaction starts, it will be in the active state. So what is the active state? So when the transaction starts its first instruction and until it completes its last instruction, so that may be 10 instruction, 50 instructions, it remains in the active state. So after the active state, you can see that there are two arrows. One is failure and one is end. And after the transaction completes its last instruction, so we say that the transaction is ended. So it will come into the partially committed state. So what is what is basically partially committed state? So in DBMS, when a transaction executes, all the updates, all the reads and writes are done first from the copy which is transferred in the memory. So the changes are not actually performed in the actual DBMS which is on the hard disk. This is to maintain the atomicity and consistency property. So if the transaction fails in between, we cannot recover if it has already been done in the hard copy. So to get the copy back to the original state, all the changes are temporarily performed in a copy of the database which is transferred from your hard disk to your memory. So until the transaction finishes its last instruction, all the changes are first performed in the memory copy. So till that, so once the last instruction execute, it becomes into the partially committed state. So after the partially committed, there is an instruction which every transaction executes that I already discussed with you and shown on you on the MySQL. So after the commit, the transaction comes into the state that is known as committed. So what is the difference between partially committed and committed? Once the transaction is committed, all the changes are made in the permanent copy of the database which is in your disk. So now, once the transaction is committed, you cannot roll back from the transaction. It is completed, it is finished, and all the changes are saved. So it is like an example. So we are booking a ticket. You have booked from in the IRCTC, you have filled the form, and then you have some given the payment, and then you have generated a ticket. So you can see the PDF copy. So when you are looking at the PDF copy and you have noticed that there is some mistake in the date, but after this ticket confirmation, you cannot roll back the transaction. Now you cannot do the changes because it is committed. All the changes have been made into the database. Although you cannot resume that particular transaction, although you can restart the another transaction, that is the cancel ticket. So in DBMS we normally call that transaction as the compensating transaction. So you will now initiate a next transaction, you will cancel this ticket, you will book a new ticket. So these are separate transactions. This is not, you cannot edit in the original ticket. So now I think it is more clear with the example. So you can see the other arrow from the active state is to the state that is failed. So in between of any transaction, there may be some hardware failure, there may be some software failure. So the transaction fails in between, and we call so if because of any reason the transaction fails, we say that it will come into the state that is failed state. So a failed transaction need to be rolled back to maintain the atomicity. So this is the task of recovery management component. So later we will see which algorithms are followed for recovery management, how it is performed in detail. But for now we can see that it come into the failed state. So from the failed state, we have to roll back to the prior state, to a prior consistent state. And once we have done the complete rollback to the prior consistent state, the transaction comes into the state which is known as the aborted state. So aborted means it is also in the consistent. Committed means it is in the consistent. But these two states are not consistent. So you can see a light arrows from both of these consistent state to a state that is a terminated state. So the terminated state means the transaction has completely performed, and now you can start the other transaction. So this is terminated. Now you cannot recover it, and next transaction can be started from its active state. So the transaction in between of its life cycle can be in any of these states, although you cannot see these states, but in actually the transaction can be in any of these states. So thank you.